Everybody hear me okay? Can you hear me out there?
Yes.
How's that? I could be right up here in it. I want to make sure you've all done your homework and have been practicing the advanced Bible lesson that I taught you last week. So start clapping. All right, and repeat after me. 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. 4, 1, 21, 1. All right, I think you got it. Have you been doing that every day at home? Yeah, right. Okay. Well, that's the basic structure of the English Bible. 39 books in the Old Testament, 27 books of the New Testament. And the first 5 and 12 of the Old Testament are pretty much chronological. And you can take the last, 5, 5, and 12, pick them up and drop them into the first 17 books. So Daniel, where we are, is one of the major prophets. And he's major not because it's more important, but because they're longer. And the minor prophets are minor, not because they're less important, but because they're short. So Daniel is in with the major prophets, the last one of the 5 of that group. And so chronologically, Daniel begins at about the end of 2 Kings, one of the historical books. And in 605, 604 BC, as we saw last time, Nebuchadnezzar came in and attacked Judah and carried off some of the royal family and the nobles back to Babylon. And Daniel and his 3 friends were among that group. And Daniel 1 to 2 makes it clear that it was God who handed the king Jehoiakim over to Nebuchadnezzar because Israel had been unfaithful to the covenant and the one they had made with God at Sinai when they came out of Egypt. And then in 722 BC, the 10 northern tribes of the northern kingdom, they were defeated by Assyria. And now the 2 southern tribes, Judah and Benjamin, are being defeated by Nebuchadnezzar. And the first time Nebuchadnezzar came was in 605. And he came back in 597, I think, because people were causing problems. They weren't paying their tribute they were supposed to pay. And then he came back in 586 and destroyed Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. And you can read about that in Lamentations, if you don't mind a lot of lament. So if you break the covenant that you've made with God, there's going to be consequences. But God had sent prophets to warn Israel and Judah to turn back to him, and that he himself would restore Israel to himself after this time of punishment. And according to Jeremiah, the exile is going to last 70 years, and Daniel will talk about that. When eventually God will make a new covenant with Israel and with Judah, and we are privileged as Christians to be grafted into the new covenant through Christ. And we just celebrated the new covenant, which was inaugurated in Jesus' blood. But complete fulfillment of the new covenant is still in the future. And Daniel talks about that later in his book. But today we're at the beginning, Daniel 1, 3 to 7. And here we're introduced to Daniel and his 3 friends, and we find out what Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians want to do with them. We learn that the world values external things. The world wants to conform us to its mold, and the world wants to change our identities. The world wants to do the same thing to us that the Babylonians were trying to do to Daniel and his friends. And so there's some good lessons here for us. And that is Daniel 1, 3-7. It is not Romans, it's Daniel. Gotta change my bookmark. Anyway, here we go. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and the literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were from Judah Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. So we see first in verses 3 and 4 that Nebuchadnezzar, and thus the world, values external things above all else. And the first thing that Ashpenaz was looking for was people from the royal family and the nobility. And this suggests that Daniel and his friends were part of David's family. They were descendants of David because descendants of David made up the royal family in Judah. Well, there may have been a few reasons for this. First, the people from the royal family would have made excellent hostages in case somebody from the homeland wanted to start trouble. These were exiles, and someone might have wanted to protest. Second, it would have helped to deplete the leadership ranks from the conquered territory of Israel. If you haul off all of the leadership potential people, you will deplete those at home that have leadership ability. And then the king, Nebuchadnezzar, could use their talents in service of his kingdom. Well, third, it would have been quite enjoyable for Nebuchadnezzar and other Babylonians to see these Israelites, and especially members of the royal family, serving them, and this would have reminded them of their great victory over that nation. And then fourth, it would have been a reminder to all of the Israelites living in exile that they had been defeated. They could look and see Daniel and his friends and other members of the royal family serving Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. So the world values people for their family connections and their ancestry. And there might be good reasons for this. Connected people always have certain advantages, and that gives them a leg up over regular people. Members of the royal family and the nobility would have had many more opportunities for education and training, and they would have had better food and better physical training, all of that kind of thing. So they would have had privilege. And today there are advantages that can come from our family and our social connections. It's not always right, but it is true. Well, Jesus doesn't care much about how we are connected. We saw in Romans that there is to be no distinction between Jews and Gentiles in the church. Jesus broke down that barrier, and he broke the distinction. God gives all of us gifts, and we are to use those gifts in his service and service to others. And we should value everybody's contribution, recognizing that our giftedness and their giftedness comes from God and is intended to be used for God's purposes. Well, maybe our connections will help advance the gospel, and we see this in the New Testament from time to time. Paul used his Roman citizenship to help his preaching from time to time, and wealthy people supported Jesus and they supported the early church. But James writes in James 2 that if we show special attention to a rich person in this case, and we treat a poor person badly, we have discriminated and become judges with evil motives, evil thoughts. In fact, God has chosen those who are poor to be rich in faith and inherit his kingdom. So whether people are rich or just well-connected or from the right family, we should not show them favoritism. If we love our neighbor as ourselves, regardless of their ancestry or status, we are doing well. But if we show favoritism, that is sin, according to James. Well, the second criterion that Nebuchadnezzar used was external beauty and perfection. It says that the people to be selected were to be young men without any physical defect, handsome. Well, like Babylon, our society values people who have no physical defects and who are physically attractive. And that is true even out in ordinary life. I've seen studies that show attractive people get all kinds of advantages out there in the world. And it's not done out in the open, but attractive people have advantages when it comes to getting hired for a job, and even when it comes to getting services from businesses. And I suppose this could happen even in a church if we're not careful. My favorite passage for this kind of things comes from 1 Samuel, where Samuel is looking for the king that God has chosen to replace Saul. And we should remember that Saul was picked by the people because they wanted a king and they saw his physical attributes. He was an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, and he was a head taller than any of the others. Well, God rejected Saul as king because of his lack of faith and his disobedience. And he sent Samuel to the house of Jesse to anoint the king that he had chosen, one of Jesse's sons. Well, when the eldest came in, Samuel looked at him and thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands before the Lord. But apparently not. Samuel was judging based on his appearance. But God said, do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at things that man looks at. Man looks at outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Well, eventually, after Samuel had gone through Jesse's sons one by one, he ran out of sons. And so he asked Jesse, are these all the sons that you have? And Jesse responded, well, there's still one, but he is out tending sheep. The youngest was David, and God had Samuel anoint David as king. And so even David's father did not think that he was king material, but the Lord God did, because the Lord looked at his heart. Well, that's a lesson for us. We have a tendency to look at outward appearances and make judgments based on outward appearances. But God looks at people's hearts, and we should strive to do that. So the criteria we have are family connections and ancestry and outward appearance. And third, we have brain power or intellectual ability. It says that he was looking for young men showing aptitude in every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand. And like these other things, brain power can really come in handy when you're trying to live out in the world. We do want a lawyer or a doctor or a teacher who has the necessary training to do the job. So the process of selecting people by their brain power isn't necessarily all bad. The question is whether we value people more as people because they are smart or because they have had a lot of education and training. Just because you are smart and well educated doesn't mean that you will be a godly person. Well, the last criterion is that they were to be qualified to serve in the king's palace. And this is thought to have something to do with physical ability. They had to be able to work. And we have done, I think, an increasingly better job in my lifetime of including disabled people in the workplace and in society. But I do think that churches should stay at the forefront of including people who might not have great physical ability or who might be disabled. And we should try to make accommodations for people when we can. We should strive to include everyone as part of the church and find a way for everyone to serve as they are able. And you might even find some real talent if you give people a chance. Obviously, God does not care at all about somebody's physical abilities or disabilities when it comes to salvation and including them in his kingdom. He has a place for everyone, and he will use a person's disability or their abilities for his glory. So there are some things in this world that require some family connections or physical beauty or brain power or physical ability to do work. And so those are the kinds of things that the world is going to value and reward. But that doesn't mean that we as Christians should value people based on their family connections or on their outward appearance or on their brain power or their ability to do physical work. These can all be useful things and help us in many ways as we try to live in the world. And they can be used to advance the gospel and God's kingdom. You all still hear me? But we shouldn't worship those things. We tend to worship physical beauty and that kind of thing. And we shouldn't judge people based on those attributes. Plus, if we happen to be blessed with one or more of those things, we should recognize that they come from God and that we ought to use them in his service. Daniel was one of the chosen few because he meets all of the criteria. But as we will see, he did not let it affect his allegiance to God. Well, now that the people have been chosen, the second part is what the king wanted to do with them. He wants to conform them to the Babylonian culture. And so it says in verses 4 and 5, he, Ashpenaz, was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. So scholars say that Babylon would train these foreign people for eventual return to the land they came from, but they were to return as loyal supporters of the Babylonian government. And so it was essentially a program of indoctrination into the worldview of Babylon. And the reprogramming included studies in the language and literature of Babylon, a special diet, and training in royal protocol. The desired outcome or the goal was reorientation of the person into the thoughts, beliefs, and practices of the Babylonians. And so this program included educational content, food, and a certain amount of time. So first, these people the young men were going to be taught the language and the literature of the Babylonians. And this is not only the general knowledge of Babylon, but also the learning of the wise men or the astrologers, maybe. One commentary calls it the science of the Babylonians. Daniel and his friends are fairly young. They might be early to mid-teens. And so they would have been about high school age. And so 3 years of such education could tend to draw them away from the faith of the Israelites, the faith in Yahweh. Well, last time I mentioned that I had read a study that said the main reason that Americans are losing their faith is the public school system. Not because public schools are necessarily explicitly anti-God or anti-Christian, but because Christianity is presented as just one of many equal options, many equal choices. Or maybe it is not presented at all. Maybe it's ignored. So I went and dug out that study because it seemed relevant to this passage. The report was done by Lyman Stone for the American Enterprise Institute, but he based it, a lot of what he says, on another study done by Raphael Frank and Lawrence Iannacone. It's probably Italian. Any Italians in the crowd? The study's called Religious Decline in the 20th Century West, Testing Alternative Explanations. And this article was published in a peer-reviewed journal, Public Choice. So it was published in a secular journal, and it was peer-reviewed, meaning that other scholars checked it out before it was published. So it wasn't maniac Christian ranting against the public school system. It was actually secular scholars. Well, what they found was that higher education attainment does not affect religiosity, and nor does a more industrialized or urban life. So it's not the case that when people get more highly educated and move out of the country, off the farm, that they leave the dumb religion behind. No, they found that religiosity is determined early in life. Kids raised without religion tend to become non-religious adults. And children who are raised with religion tend to be religious as adults. And the religion then the religiosity tends to increase as they get older. But childhood religiosity, and they say religiosity because they looked at all different kinds of religions, childhood religiosity is heavily affected by government spending on education. And so it's not educational attainment that affects or reduces religiosity, but it's government control of education. And this conclusion comes from a peer-reviewed article in a secular journal. Well, the vast majority of the change in levels in religiosity in a nation over time is not because adults, older people, convert away from the religion, but simply because the next generation is not as religious as the one that came before. And so in America, people born in the early 1900s attended church on average 31 times per year as a child. And people born in the 1970s or 1980s attended on average 25 times per year. But people born in the 1990s attended an average of only 22 times per year. So that's about a 33% reduction from the 1900s, and it's less than half of the Sundays in a given year. And it's probably even less today. One recent statistic said that most people attend church less than 12 times a year. Now, when I was a kid, we attended church 156 times a year, at least. Well, another study shows that from 1930 to 1960, between 60 and 65% of Americans attended church in any given week. Well, by 2017, the average was down to between 25 and 35%. So that's almost half. And the predictions are that this will be cut in half again by 2050. And so it's quite a change from the early 1900s, the 1930s. So secularization in America is not a story of people leaving their faith. It's a story of fewer people having any religious upbringing at all. And the author says, It is striking that religiosity declined so much between the ages of 12 and 18 before the children have left the home. Most likely, the author says, instead of a religious school supporting and encouraging religious behavior and instruction, high school becomes a season of secularization. Well, in early America, education was religious as a matter of law. Public school had a moral and religious purpose. But under our system, we cannot prefer one religion over another, and we can't prefer religion over non-religion, over atheism. And so state courts began to limit what the schools could do, how much the government was allowed to do to support parental choices. Then, around 1940, the U.S. Supreme Court began applying the federal Constitution to local education, and it continues to this day. It's illegal to talk about your faith in a public school. I suppose unless somebody asked you. We were listening to a chapel the other day, and the lady was she was a counselor, a Christian counselor who worked in a government facility. And she said it was illegal for her to talk about Christianity, but if she could get the client to ask her the right question, then she could tell them. So she learned how to get people to ask the right question. I'll probably get her in trouble. Well, not only that, but schools have also begun to claim an ever-increasing share of the children's lives. So not only have public schools become more secular, the kids spend more and more time there. So what we have then is observational evidence that church attendance and religiosity are decreasing in America and have been decreasing for decades. And this is widely reported, and we can see it for ourselves. Then we have scholarly studies by secular scholars even that attribute this mainly to the government's control of education. So we have basically the same situation that existed in Daniel's time, except that he was forcibly hauled off to another country and compelled by his captors to be in that program. We voluntarily send our kids to these public schools where they are to a greater and greater extent being programmed by the public education system into being more and more secularized, not believing in God and not being part of his church. Furthermore, parents are attending church less and less often, and therefore their children are attending church less and less often. And as a consequence, the children do not see church or God as very important. If God really was God, wouldn't mom and dad show up at his church more often? Well, I understand why parents send their kids to public schools. Homeschooling is very hard, and private schools are very expensive. We sent our kids to Canby public schools, and I have to say, I think they are more secularized than I was, but I went to a private Christian high school. We made sure they were in church almost every Sunday, and we hope and pray that this training will offset the influence they got from the public school system. Also, the cause and effect are maybe something that we would not have realized until recently. The studies I cited there were done in 2020 and 2014, so they're not very old. But now we have seen what is happening, and we have a pretty good explanation for it. So the question is, what are we going to do? And the only solution I can think of is for Christian parents to get their kids out of the public school. I don't know if that will work. The ideal solution would be for the government spending on education to follow the kid around, so that the funding could go with the kid for homeschooling or to a private school. But that would be an epic change in the system, and it would be vehemently opposed by some quarters. So in the absence of such epic change, we have to do our best to train children in the things of God. And so I appreciate Brenda and the Young Life team in Canby for making Christ's presence felt in the high school and the junior high school there. We are going to have to do as much of that kind of thing as we can. If we have children, we have to make the commitment to get them to church as often as we can, and to getting them grounded in the Christian faith. They will know what we believe in, and what is important to us by what our actions are, by what we do. That was education. Another part of the program, the reprogramming effort, had to do with food, the food that the captives ate. And so it says, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. Now I'm not sure how this would apply generally to captives in Babylon, but Daniel and the other Israelites had strict dietary laws that they were supposed to follow. And the diet the Babylonians wanted them to eat was a violation of those dietary laws. Some of the meat was unclean. Some of the food had been offered to idols as sacrifices, that kind of thing. So Daniel and his friends were confronted with a dilemma. Would they go ahead and partake of this unclean food? This is a sort of a foreshadow of the next sermon, and so I'll just leave it there. But the main point for us is that the world will ask us to compromise our commitment to God by tempting us to do things that God has told us are unholy, or at least inappropriate for his people. We are not subject to Jewish food restrictions. As we saw in Romans, even Paul, a devout Jew and a Pharisee, believed that no food was unclean, because Jesus had declared all food clean. We are going to have more issues with media, TV, movies, books, music, social media. Is the media we interact with holy and pleasing to God? And I mentioned before, I sometimes watch Whose Line Is It Anyways on TV, and it can be really funny sometimes. But every now and then they get really crude. And so then I have to turn it off. And I wonder sometimes why I turn it on in the first place. But it is funny. All of us will be tempted in different areas, and we must understand what God's will is, what his good, pleasing, and perfect will is, and try to please God by our thoughts and behavior. The world will constantly be trying to lead us away. The third aspect of the training regimen was the time. These boys were to be trained for 3 years. And I found it interesting that their age and the length of training corresponds pretty well to our high school years. And these are very formative years and a good time for kids to be trained, either to be secularized or to be trained for godly living. And so if we have kids at that age, we have to do a better job of training them in godly ways. So the world values external things like family connections, external beauty, brain power, and physical ability, and then it seeks to conform us into its mold. And Paul says in Romans 12, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Well, third, the world seeks to change or to define our identity. And so the third aspect of the Babylonian reprogramming and reorientation effort was a change of name, symbolizing the loyalty of the new subject to the king. And it says in verses 6 to 7, among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. And so here we're introduced to Daniel and his three friends, and they will be the heroes or the protagonists of the story. Well, their Jewish names were Daniel, which means God is my judge. Hananiah means Yahweh has been gracious. Mishael means who is or what is God. And Azariah means Yahweh has helped. And so often in Jewish names you'll see El or Yah as part of the name. And El is short for Elohim, and Yah is short for Yahweh. Well, the Babylonians wanted to change the identity of these young men, so they changed their names. They changed Daniel to Belteshazzar, which means Bel protects his life. Hananiah to Shadrach, which means command of Aku, or I am fearful of Aku. Mishael to Meshach, which means who is what Aku is. Who is what Aku is. And Azariah to Abednego, which means servant of the Shining One, or servant of Nebo. Now, I can always remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego because when I was really little, we would beg my older sister to tell us a bedtime story, and she would say, okay. We would get ready, and then she would come in, and she would say, Shadrach, Meshach, and to bed we go. And that was the story. Very disappointing. Very disappointing. Well, Bel, Aku, and Nebo are gods of Babylon. And so the Babylonians are trying to alter these boys' identities away from Yahweh, the God of Israel, and towards the king of Babylon and the gods of Babylon. It's doubtful that many of us will ever change our names unless we get married. Women will change their last names when they get married and take the last name of their husband. Nowadays, couples sometimes take each other's name when they get married. That's a change of identity. It's saying, I'm married now. I have changed a few people's names legally. Often it has to do with their identity. One time it was a kid who was raised by his stepfather, and he wanted to change his last name to the stepfather's last name. That was a change of identity for him. He is saying, this guy is really my father, and not that other guy whose only influence in my life was the last name that I happen to have. Sometimes women, usually women, but maybe more men now, they'll get divorced, and for some reason they didn't change their last name during the divorce. That's a change of identity too, when they come to me and I go and change their name legally. They're saying, I used to be married to this guy whose last name I have, but now I'm not, and I'm taking my name back since we're no longer married. And I suppose more men would do that as more people take both names. I've had people who just start using a new name because of some criminal or less than honorable activity that they were engaged with. And the name they had when they were doing those things kind of follows them around. They don't legally change it, they just start using another name. Well, if we are Christians, we have taken on the identity of Christ. We are Christ followers, we're Christians. And the world and Satan would like to destroy or limit our identification with Christ. Well, we sometimes associate our identities with people or entities. Brenda and I are loyal followers of the 3-time national champion Oregon State Beaver baseball team. And we also identify with the Portland Trailblazers. So we have some identification with them. Now, I'm not sure why anyone would want to associate with the Oregon Ducks, but they do. And I've learned from Romans 14 not to judge or despise people for these kinds of things. That might be a disputable matter. So there's no harm in identifying with a sports team or your college team. I actually went to Oregon State. So we could get excessively involved and identify too much with these people or organizations. Well, we might also identify with Black Lives Matter. I saw a sign out over here. Or Antifa, or QAnon, or the Proud Boys. And these movements might not be compatible with being a Christian. We might support and identify with the Democrat or Republican political parties, and maybe one of the smaller parties. And we should be involved in politics. But we don't want our identity or allegiance to be with a political party or a candidate. Our allegiance is to Christ. And we support political parties and candidates only when and only to the extent doing so doesn't conflict with our highest priority. The world and the media would like to change our identity and our allegiance. And so we have to be careful. It's very easy to get off track. As we'll see coming up, it appears that only Daniel and his 3 friends, of all those who were hauled off to Babylon, stood firm against what the Babylonians were trying to do. Only 4 out of, I'm not sure how many. Well, imagine being a teenage boy and being taken away from your home in Oregon and exiled to a foreign country, maybe China or Russia. The people there notice how connected you are. You come from the right families, prominent families, and how handsome you are and how smart you are. And they take you into special training so you can have a prominent role in this kingdom. That would be pretty exciting. But they also change your name, and your new name includes names of their gods. And they want you to eat foods that are unclean according to your God, the God you believe to be the one true God. What are you going to do? Well, that's a good question for us too. The world would like to conform us into its image and take us away from our identity in Christ. Even our public education system is set up to secularize us. The world wants us to value the same things that it values. And it is having some success as religiosity and church attendance are on a steady decline. And so we'll see in upcoming passages in Daniel how he and his friends stand firm in the face of the Babylonians' attempts to reprogram them into loyalty to Babylon and to its gods. And we'll see how God blesses and protects them as they do that. Daniel?
Well, another thing we can think of as an application to this message is who is our ultimate government. And as we pray the Lord's Prayer, we pray, Thy kingdom come,